6 months after my boss publicly destroyed my career, he walked into my office carrying a resume and asked me for a job. He didn't know I was the CEO. He didn't know the company interviewing him had taken clients from the business he once controlled. And he certainly didn't know that every success he had spent a decade claiming as his own had been built on work he stole from me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Rowan Sinclair. I am 31 years old, and 6 months earlier, I sat in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a Chicago high-rise while my career was executed in front of 27 silent witnesses. At the head of the table sat Damian Mercer. The board wanted answers after a major client contract collapsed. Millions of dollars were gone. Investors were demanding explanations. Someone had to take the blame. Damian had already decided who that would be. Me. I listened while he carefully rewrote months of documented history. Risks I had identified became failures I had supposedly ignored. Decisions he approved became mistakes he claimed I made. The truth was dismantled piece by piece until it no longer resembled reality. I kept waiting for someone to speak. Nobody did. Not the executives who had read my reports. Not the managers who had attended the meetings. Not the colleagues who knew exactly what had happened. The room stayed silent. Then Damian leaned back in his chair and smiled. It was the smile of a man convinced he had already won. "You'll never work in this industry again." The words landed harder than I expected. Not because I believed him, because everyone else did. 27 people sat around that table and not one challenged him. Most couldn't even look at me. 10 minutes later the meeting ended. An hour later security escorted me through the lobby. I packed 10 years of work into a cardboard box and walked out of Meridian Logistics for what everyone assumed was the last time. As the elevator descended, I should have felt defeated. Instead, I felt something else. Clarity. Because for the first time in 10 years, I no longer had a reason to protect the people who had spent years taking credit for what I built. What Damian never understood was that while he was busy building a reputation, I was building value. I created systems that saved millions. I rescued failing accounts. I solved problems executives couldn't solve themselves. And I kept records of everything. Every project. Every proposal. Every revision. Every timestamp. I didn't know then how important those records would become. I only knew one thing. The story Damian told in that conference room was a lie. And lies have a weakness. Eventually they collide with evidence. 6 months later, I sat behind the desk of a company I owned, looking at a resume with Damian Mercer's name printed across the top. For a long moment I simply stared at it. The man who promised I would never work in this industry again was asking for a place in the one I had built. What he didn't know was that the real reason his empire was beginning to collapse had nothing to do with bad luck, market conditions, or changing trends. It had everything to do with the woman he thought he had erased. Because the reputation Damian Mercer spent a decade building wasn't his. Every word of it was mine. The truth was simple. Nobody handed me anything. When I joined Meridian Logistics at 23, I didn't arrive with a famous last name, a mentor in the executive suite, or family connections waiting to accelerate my career. I arrived with a business degree, a willingness to work harder than everyone around me, and the belief that results mattered. For a long time that belief seemed reasonable. I started at the bottom. The assignments nobody wanted landed on my desk. Failing accounts. Frustrated clients. Operational problems that had already passed through 3 departments without a solution. I accepted all of them. Not because I enjoyed fixing disasters, but because every problem taught me something the training manuals never could. Year after year, I became the person managers called when a situation was about to spiral out of control. When deadlines slipped, I found ways to recover them. When clients threatened to leave, I rebuilt trust. When systems stopped working, I redesigned them. The strange thing was that success rarely changed anything. The company benefited. The executives benefited. The numbers improved. Then everyone moved on to the next crisis. I stayed behind and solved that one too. As Meridian expanded, my responsibilities grew with it. Entire processes ran through systems I had designed. Teams relied on workflows I created. Clients remained because of relationships I spent years building. The work mattered. The recognition never arrived. Performance reviews praised my dedication. Managers thanked me for my commitment. Leadership spoke about teamwork and company culture. Then promotion season came. Someone else always got the title. Someone else always got the larger office. Someone else always stood in front of the room accepting credit. Most often that person was Damian Mercer. At first I convinced myself it didn't matter. Careers take time. Reputations take time. Eventually people notice who is creating value. That was what I told myself during late nights in the office while others went home. That was what I believed when projects succeeded and my contribution became a footnote. That was what I repeated whenever disappointment threatened to become resentment. Patience, I thought, was part of the process. Good work compounds. Keep building. Keep delivering. Your opportunity will come. For 10 years that belief kept me moving forward. Then came the project that changed everything. 6 months of research. 6 months of testing. 6 months of refining a strategy capable of transforming one of Meridian's largest divisions. I poured everything into it. Every recommendation was supported by data. Every risk had a solution. Every projection had been verified repeatedly. It was the strongest work I had ever produced. When the presentation was finally scheduled, I assumed I would be in the room discussing the results. Instead, I received a calendar invitation as an observer. That felt strange, but I ignored the feeling. On the morning of the presentation, I walked into the boardroom carrying a notebook and took a seat near the back. Executives filled the room. Board members arrived. Then Damien stepped to the front. The first slide appeared on the screen. I looked up, and my stomach dropped, as I recognized every chart, every model, every recommendation. 6 months of my work was displayed for everyone to see. There was only one thing missing. My name wasn't anywhere on the screen. For a few seconds I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Damien was introducing the project before bringing me into the discussion. Maybe the board had received a shortened version of the presentation. Maybe my name would appear later. Then he started speaking. And every hope disappeared. He walked the board through the forecasting model as if he had built it himself. He explained the integration architecture. He outlined the projected savings. He answered questions using notes taken directly from reports I had written. The more he spoke, the clearer the truth became. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an oversight. It was theft. Months of work had been transferred from my desk to his reputation. I sat quietly while executives nodded in approval. Several board members leaned forward with growing interest as Damien described the potential impact. One called the proposal groundbreaking. Another described it as the most promising operational strategy Meridian had presented in years. Each compliment landed exactly where Damien wanted it to. On himself. Not once did he acknowledge the person who had actually created it. Not once did he mention the hundreds of hours behind the model. Not once did he look in my direction. The presentation lasted less than an hour. At the end, the room erupted into applause. Board members stood from their chairs. A standing ovation. For him. I remember staring at the conference table while everyone congratulated Damien. Handshakes. Smiles. Promises about future opportunities. The celebration continued around me as though I didn't exist. Nobody questioned the ownership. Nobody asked who developed the framework. Nobody seemed interested in looking beneath the surface. The meeting ended and people filed out discussing Damien's brilliance. I remained seated until the room was empty. Then I gathered my notebook and walked back to my office. Something had changed. Not anger. Not yet. Certainty. For years I had ignored small signs. Ideas that migrated upward without attribution. Projects where recognition somehow found everyone except the people doing the work. Successes that became someone else's story once executives entered the room. I had always explained it away. That day removed every excuse. The pattern was no longer invisible. It was undeniable. That evening the office emptied around me. The lights switched off floor by floor. Cleaning crews moved through the hallways. I stayed. When the building became quiet, I opened my laptop and created a folder. Then I started collecting evidence. Every email connected to the forecasting model. Every draft. Every revision. Every file history. Every timestamp showing exactly when documents were created and modified. Every message proving where the ideas originated. The process took hours. When I finished, the folder contained a complete timeline. Anyone willing to examine it carefully could trace every recommendation back to me. I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wondered whether I was being paranoid. Maybe nothing would happen. Maybe I would never need any of it. But another part of me understood something important. People can manipulate conversations. They can rewrite meetings. They can reshape narratives. Documents are harder to silence. Facts leave footprints. And footprints become trails. Before shutting down my laptop, I copied the folder to a secure backup drive and locked it away. Then I went home. I had no idea what that folder would eventually mean. I didn't know careers would rise and fall because of what it contained. I only knew one thing. The truth was preserved. And one day when the right moment arrived, that truth would destroy Damian Mercer. For months, nothing happened. The forecasting model moved into implementation. Damian enjoyed the praise that came with it. Meridian continued operating as if everything was normal. Then one of the company's largest client contracts began to unravel. The account had generated revenue for years. Losing it would create a problem nobody could hide. Senior leadership demanded explanations. Emergency meetings filled calendars. Executives searched for someone responsible. I already knew what had happened. Months earlier, I had identified weaknesses in the client's operational structure. The risks were clear. If specific changes weren't made, the partnership would eventually fail. I documented every concern. Then I sent them. The first warning received no response. The second was acknowledged and ignored. The third disappeared into another meeting. By the sixth warning, I understood nobody intended to act. The client left anyway. The fallout arrived immediately. Board members wanted answers. Investors wanted accountability. Damian wanted protection. The meeting that followed wasn't designed to find the truth. It was designed to contain damage. I sat across from executives who already looked nervous. Financial projections covered the screens. Questions came quickly. Then Damian began speaking. I listened as he reconstructed the entire timeline. The warnings became recommendations I had supposedly failed to communicate properly. The risks became issues I had allegedly misunderstood. His decisions disappeared from the story altogether. Every explanation moved responsibility one step further away from him and one step closer to me. It was impressive in a disturbing way. He never raised his voice. Never hesitated. Never appeared uncertain. By the time he finished, the room was looking at me instead of him. The facts had not changed. Only the narrative had. I could have defended myself. I could have opened emails. I could have challenged every statement. That I stayed quiet. Not because I lacked evidence. Because I finally understood what kind of game I was playing. The moment Damian realized I wasn't fighting back, he became more confident. Then he delivered the sentence that would follow me for months. You'll never work in this industry again. No hesitation. No warning. Just a public execution disguised as leadership. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Human Resources was waiting outside. Security arrived before I reached my office. Word spread through the floor faster than I did. Employees watched from desks and hallways as I carried a cardboard box toward the elevators. Some looked shocked. Others looked away. Nobody intervened. The doors closed behind me and 10 years at Meridian ended. What Damian never knew was that my future had stopped depending on Meridian long before that day. For 2 years after work and on weekends, I had been spending time somewhere else. A rented workspace no larger than a storage unit. One desk. One laptop. One idea. While he was busy protecting his position inside Meridian, I had been quietly building something of my own. To him it would have looked like a hobby. To me it was an exit. And very soon it was about to become his worst nightmare. The morning after my termination, I unlocked the door to the small workspace I had been renting for 2 years and sat alone at the desk in the center of the room. For the first time there was no Meridian waiting for me. No meetings. No executive approvals. No reporting structure. Just me and the company I had been building in the background. Atlas Flow. The idea behind it came from a problem I had spent years watching companies accept as normal. Logistics systems rarely communicated properly with one another. Information became trapped inside separate platforms. Teams spent countless hours transferring data manually. Delays multiplied. Errors spread. Money disappeared. Most companies treated those inefficiencies as unavoidable. I never believed they were. Atlas Flow was designed to connect fragmented systems into a single operational flow. Information moved faster. Decisions became easier. Costs dropped. The solution worked. The challenge was turning it into a business. While employed at Meridian, I had developed Atlas Flow carefully. Every expense was calculated. Every risk was controlled. Growth was slow because it had to be. That changed the moment I lost my job. Suddenly there was nothing left to protect. I moved my savings into the company. Then my retirement account. Then every reserve fund I had built over the years. Friends called it reckless. Maybe they were right. If Atlas Flow failed, I would be starting over from zero. But failure carried less weight than spending another decade building value for someone else. For the first time, every decision belonged to me. Every success. Every mistake. Every outcome. The responsibility was terrifying. It was also freeing. The first few weeks felt endless. I spent mornings meeting potential clients and nights refining the platform. Some meetings ended politely. Others ended quickly. Many produced nothing at all. Then the first contract arrived. A regional distributor agreed to test the system. The deal wasn't large, but it was enough. Enough revenue to keep moving. Enough proof that someone believed in the product. 3 weeks later, another client signed. Then 2 more. The momentum grew faster than I expected. Each implementation produced measurable results. Costs decreased. Processing times improved. Clients began recommending AtlasFlow to other companies. The referrals created opportunities one could never have purchased through advertising. Within months, the client list expanded from one company to several. Then several became more than a dozen. For the first time in my professional life, the work I completed each day belonged entirely to me. There was no executive taking credit. No presentation carrying someone else's name. No waiting for permission. I wasn't helping build another person's future. I was building my own. One afternoon, while reviewing implementation reports, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a company I recognized immediately. They had been one of Meridian's most loyal clients for 11 years. I answered. What the executive said next changed everything. The executive didn't waste time. He told me his company had been reviewing operational costs for months and wanted to see what AtlasFlow could do. We scheduled a demonstration for the following week. I expected questions. I expected negotiations. I expected a long sales process. Instead, the meeting lasted less than an hour. When the presentation ended, the executive closed his notebook, looked at his team and nodded. Then he turned back to me. We'd like to move forward. That was it. No second round. No competing proposal. No delay. An 11-year Meridian client decided to transfer its account after seeing a single demonstration. The significance of that decision became clear within weeks. Other companies began reaching out. Some arrived through referrals. Others came through industry contacts. A few simply wanted to understand why businesses were suddenly talking about AtlasFlow. The conversations turned into contracts. The contracts turned into growth. For the first time, I needed help. The company could no longer operate with a small team handling everything. We started hiring. The first call came from a systems engineer I had worked with years earlier. Then an analyst. Then a project manager. Soon there were more. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. Nobody talked about revenge. Nobody complained about Damien. They talked about frustration. About ideas that disappeared after meetings. About projects where ownership became difficult to trace. About wanting to work somewhere effort and recognition stayed connected. I understood exactly what they meant. AtlasFlow became a place where contributions remained attached to the people who created them. The effect was immediate. Strong employees attracted other strong employees. Execution improved. Clients noticed. Growth accelerated. The company doubled in size. Then it doubled again. New accounts arrived faster than we anticipated. Hiring plans expanded. Revenue projections had to be revised repeatedly because reality kept exceeding expectations. While AtlasFlow moved forward, news from Meridian painted a different picture. Several accounts had left. Others were reviewing alternatives. Questions started appearing during board meetings. Why were long-term clients departing? Why were respected employees resigning? Why did innovation seem to be happening somewhere else? For years, Damien had controlled every answer. He knew how to manage perceptions. He knew how to redirect blame. He knew how to shape a story before anyone examined the facts. But narratives become difficult to maintain when numbers move in the wrong direction. Client losses couldn't be explained away forever. Employee departures created their own questions. Results demanded accountability. And accountability was something Damien had spent years avoiding. The pressure inside Meridian continued growing. Outside the company, AtlasFlow's reputation expanded across the industry. People began paying attention to our success. Investors noticed. Journalists noticed. Eventually, one national business publication noticed. A reporter requested an interview. I agreed. A few weeks later, the article appeared. And buried within that story was a detail Damien Mercer never wanted the industry to read. The article appeared on a Monday morning. By noon, my inbox was full. The publication was one of the most respected business magazines in the country, and the headline attracted attention immediately. Former analyst builds fastest-growing logistics startup in the Midwest. The reporter had spent weeks interviewing clients, employees, investors, and industry experts. The final piece focused on Atlas Flow's growth, the technology behind it, and the speed at which the company had expanded. There was nothing controversial about the article. At least not at first glance. A photograph accompanied the story. I was standing inside Atlas Flow's headquarters, surrounded by employees and screens displaying live operational data. There was no attempt to create an image. No dramatic pose. Just a founder at work. The first sections discussed our platform and the results clients were achieving. The next section covered the company's expansion. Then came a paragraph that changed everything. It wasn't even presented as a major revelation. The reporter simply noted that several methodologies powering Atlas Flow had originated during my years at Meridian Logistics. One sentence. That was all it took. People started asking questions. Investors wanted details. Industry analysts began comparing timelines. Journalists started reviewing old presentations, conference appearances, and public records. The more they looked, the more unusual the pattern became. Many of Meridian's most celebrated innovations had appeared while I worked there. Several operational frameworks linked to Damien's reputation matched projects I had directly supervised. The timing raised even more questions. Atlas Flow's technology accelerated almost immediately after my departure. Meanwhile, Meridian's pace of innovation slowed. The contrast was difficult to ignore. Industry publications began discussing it openly. Executives who had never paid attention to me before suddenly remembered meetings, projects, and presentations. Former employees received calls from reporters. Current employees faced questions from board members. People started connecting pieces that had remained separate for years. The narrative Damien spent a decade building depended on one assumption. That nobody would look closely. Now everyone was looking. The pressure inside Meridian increased quickly. Directors wanted explanations. Board members wanted documentation. Shareholders wanted reassurance. Simple answers no longer satisfied anyone. The company couldn't dismiss the questions because too many of them were supported by evidence. And evidence has a habit of creating more questions. A few weeks later, I heard something through a former colleague still working inside Meridian. Someone at the company had filed a formal request for an internal review. What started as a few uncomfortable conversations became an official investigation. Outside consultants were brought in. Records were examined. Project histories were reviewed. Years of documentation were placed under scrutiny. For the first time, people with authority were looking beyond presentations and examining the work itself. I thought about the folder sitting safely in my archives. The one I had created years earlier. The one containing emails, drafts, revisions, and timestamps. Back then, I saved it because I believed the truth mattered. Now the truth was finally being examined. And what investigators were about to uncover would cost Damien Mercer everything he had spent years building. The investigation lasted several months. There were no dramatic announcements. No public accusations. No leaks to the media. The board wanted facts. So investigators worked quietly. They reviewed archived emails, project records, approval histories, internal reports, and years of company documentation. Former employees were interviewed. Current managers were questioned. Timelines were reconstructed. The deeper they looked, the worse the findings became. What initially appeared to be isolated incidents turned out to be a pattern. Ideas created by others had repeatedly been presented under Damien's name. Recommendations developed by teams had been redirected toward his personal brand. Successful projects became evidence of his leadership while the people responsible remained invisible. The investigators found examples stretching back years. Then they uncovered something even more damaging. Several costly decisions had been attributed to lower-level employees despite records showing executive involvement. Responsibility had been moved. Credit had been moved. Narratives had been adjusted. The paper trail told a very different story from the one Meridian had been hearing for years. By that point, the outcome was becoming obvious. Board members stopped defending him. Executives who once aligned themselves closely with him suddenly became distant. People who had benefited from his influence developed remarkable memories about meetings they previously claimed not to remember. Support disappeared quickly. Success attracts loyalty. Trouble reveals how much of that loyalty was rented. The board scheduled a formal vote regarding Damien's future with the company. The vote never happened. He resigned first. The announcement was released early on a Thursday morning. Short, carefully worded, professional. But everyone in the industry understood what it meant. Within hours, the story spread across business networks, executive circles, and recruiting firms. The reaction was immediate. Companies that once competed to hire him showed no interest. Speaking invitations vanished. Investment opportunities disappeared. Consulting inquiries stopped arriving. The influence he had spent years accumulating began evaporating almost overnight. People who once returned his calls immediately suddenly became difficult to reach. Former allies discovered urgent scheduling conflicts. Professional relationships built around status rarely survive the loss of status. For years, Damien had operated as though consequences applied to other people. Now they had finally reached him. I didn't celebrate. There was no satisfaction in watching a career collapse. Mostly I felt relieved. The truth had survived long enough to be seen. What happened afterward belonged to him. Atlas Flow continued growing. New clients arrived. New partnerships formed. The company kept moving forward while Meridian worked through the aftermath of the investigation. Then 3 weeks after Damien's resignation, I was reviewing quarterly reports when an email arrived from our HR director. There was no explanation. No summary. Just a forwarded job application attached to the message. Above it she had written a single sentence. "You'll want to see this yourself." Curious, I opened the file. Then I saw the name at the top of the resume. And for a moment I genuinely thought I was reading it wrong. Damien Mercer had just applied for a job at Atlas Flow. I stared at the resume for several minutes. The name didn't change. Damien Mercer. The same man who once sat across a conference table and declared my career finished was applying for a senior strategy position at Atlas Flow. His qualifications were impressive on paper. Years of executive experience, industry knowledge, leadership roles. References listed neatly at the bottom of the page. What wasn't included was the story behind his departure from Meridian. That part I already knew. My HR director asked if she should reject the application immediately. I told her no. Then I surprised even myself. I scheduled an interview. Not because I was considering hiring him. Not because I wanted revenge. I wanted to understand something. For years I had only known Damien Mercer as a man protected by authority. He always had a title behind his name, executives supporting his decisions, and a company absorbing the consequences of his mistakes. Now all of that was gone. I wanted to see who remained when the protection disappeared. The interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday. At exactly 9 o'clock he walked into Atlas Flow headquarters. The difference was noticeable immediately. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Professionally. The confidence that once filled every room had been replaced by caution. The performance was gone. No audience remained to perform for. I greeted him politely and invited him into the conference room. For the next 40 minutes, we discussed strategy, operations, leadership challenges, and industry trends. He answered professionally. His experience was real. His knowledge was real. For most of the conversation, neither of us mentioned the obvious history sitting between us. It remained in the room anyway. Every pause carried it. Every glance acknowledged it. Eventually the interview reached its natural conclusion. I closed the folder in front of me. Then I asked the only question that actually mattered. "Do you remember the last thing you said to me?" The effect was immediate. His expression changed before he answered. His eyes dropped toward the table. For several seconds neither of us spoke. I waited. There was no attempt to reinterpret the moment. No explanation. No effort to argue context. No claim that I had misunderstood him. Because there was nothing to misunderstand. Both of us remembered the sentence perfectly. The silence stretched between us. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. For the first time since I had known him, Damien wasn't controlling the conversation. He wasn't controlling the story either. The facts required no debate. Eventually he nodded once. A small acknowledgement. Nothing more. But it was enough. The interview ended a few minutes later. I thanked him for his time. He thanked me for the opportunity. Then he stood and walked toward the door. As it closed behind him, I remained alone in the conference room. The decision sitting in front of me had very little to do with Damien. It had everything to do with me. Years earlier, someone with power had chosen humiliation when they had every opportunity to choose integrity. Now I was the one holding the power. And whatever happened next would reveal what kind of leader I had become. The decision took less time than I expected. Not because it was easy. Because the answer had been obvious from the moment I opened the resume. When Damien returned to the conference room, he looked prepared for rejection. What he didn't know was that I had no interest in repeating the past. Humiliation had already been done. It hadn't improved anyone. It hadn't built anything. I wasn't going to turn leadership into a performance simply because I finally had the opportunity. I thanked him for coming. I told him we had completed our review of the position. Then I explained that another candidate had been selected. He nodded slowly. There was disappointment in his expression but not surprise. I think he had expected that outcome from the beginning. Before he stood, I decided to say one final thing. Not for closure. Not for revenge. Simply because it was true. Leadership requires trust, I said. I don't trust you. The words hung in the room for a moment. Unlike years earlier, there was no audience. No executives. No board members. No employees watching from the sidelines. Just two people sitting across a table. He accepted the statement without argument. There was nothing left to defend. After a brief nod, he stood and walked toward the door. Then he left. I watched through the conference room glass as he crossed the lobby and disappeared outside. Nobody paid attention. Nobody stopped what they were doing. The moment passed quietly. The same way my departure from Meridian should have passed years before. Once he was gone, I returned to work. There were clients waiting for updates. Teams preparing new projects. Expansion plans requiring decisions. The company continued moving forward because that was what healthy organizations do. Months passed. Atlas Flow grew beyond anything I imagined in that tiny rented workspace. New offices opened. Long-term contracts were renewed. Investors increased their commitments. Employees built careers inside a culture based on accountability and respect. Trust became our greatest advantage. People shared ideas without worrying about ownership. Success belonged to the people who earned it. Recognition followed contribution. The environment I once searched for had become the one I created. Eventually, I stopped thinking about the conference room at Meridian. I stopped replaying the sentence Damien had spoken years earlier. Not because I forgot it, because it no longer mattered. The greatest victory was never proving him wrong. The greatest victory was building a life that no longer required his approval. Someone once tried to erase my future with 7 words. In the end, those words became irrelevant. Because the most powerful response to being underestimated is not revenge. It is creating something so real, so lasting, and so completely your own that the opinion of the person who doubted you becomes meaningless. Some victories aren't about getting even, they're about moving forward. Subscribe for more unforgettable stories and share in the comments. Have you ever succeeded after someone counted you out?